Hey folks, welcome to the Processing Blue podcast. I'm Panthers beat reporter Mike Kaye here with Charlotte Observer sports columnist, the great Scott Fowler. Scott, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Mike. Yeah, we're doing a little emergency pod session here in the evening. Finally, we got the end of this news story today that you've been working on for weeks.
And yes, the white smoke is right. Like we can finally kind of breathe a little bit. Dave Canales has been hired as the Panthers' new head coach. The former Buccaneers offensive coordinator, who was there for just 1 year and just revitalized Baker Mayfield's career, has agreed to a contract. He will be the next guy to lead Bryce Young. He comes from the offensive side of the ball. He's 42 years old. And he was a longtime member of the Seattle Seahawks, just like newly promoted GM slash president of football operations Dan Morgan. The buddy system wins.
Yes.
According to ESPN, this deal is for 6 years. Matt Rule got 7. Dave Canales, who has been an offensive coordinator in the NFL for 1 year, gets a 6-year deal. You and I have talked at length about how unappealing both this GM and head coaching job seemed from the outside. The Panthers didn't wait till the end of the playoffs for the most enticing on paper candidates. They rushed to hire a guy who was not interviewed by any other team for their opening. There were 8 total openings this offseason. 7 of them had active searches. 2 were still open. But they land their guy, Dave Canales, who has spent 8 years with Dan Morgan in Seattle, and here we are. What are your thoughts initially on this, Scott?
Well, it's an out of the box hire, I think, a little bit because of what you said. I mean, they didn't certainly get the hottest name, but that is, as we know, not necessarily that's not necessarily the best. My just guess on this, Mike, is that Ben Johnson, through intermediaries of some type, let them know that that wasn't going to happen. And
Right.
maybe they like Dave Canales better than anybody else. I mean, there are some attributes here, and first among them to me is the fact that he made Baker Mayfield into more than a serviceable quarterback this year. He made him into a very good quarterback. I mean, he had 28 touchdowns and 10 interceptions in the season, and that I would have never thought could have happened again after you and I watched Baker last year. He was a disaster on the football field, just terrible. Got Matt Rule fired, I thought, more than anything else. That was the reason Matt Rule only lasted 5 games in that last season. And yet, of course, he had Mike Evans. He had some other really good players in Tampa Bay, which Dan Morgan's going to have to fix that part. But I think Canales can coach. I think you made a point in something you wrote, Mike, that I liked, that maybe in a year he would have been a hot candidate. Maybe they're hiring him, quote, a year earlier than most people said. Wasn't that? Didn't you say something like that?
Yeah, I think in talking to folks around the league during this surge, a lot of people said Dave Canales is worthy of an interview, but that he might be a year away. We saw that with Ben Johnson last year, where he kind of stopped midway through the search, re-upped his value this year, and now he's seen as a super hot candidate outside of Carolina. I think when we talk about searching for these guys that are first or second year offensive coordinators, there's not a lot of information on them. These guys are really working their way up and really kind of reaching the brains of these executives and these other coaches and networking. And Dave Canales has got a really nice ecosystem here. He's got Dan Morgan, who he worked with for 8 years in Seattle. They come from the same organizational tree. They probably have very similar philosophies. And that might help them be in lockstep. Now, the Panthers, via their website, did something strange and said that they just came right out and said that both Dan Morgan and Dave Canales will answer to David Tepper. Now, that drew some ire immediately. That said, I'm not as concerned given that they have very similar backgrounds and probably philosophies. I don't know if Dave Canales gets hired this quickly or is rushed to hire this guy if they're not kind of in lockstep from their thinkings and their philosophies. I think what this allows you to do is let's say somebody bombs, you can hold them accountable in their own job. It doesn't have to feel like just because Dan Morgan's failed or just because Dave Canales has failed that you have to punish both. That said, given the way these optics are, it would not shock me if that were to happen. Now, you look at the contract that ESPN reported is 6 years. Sounds like these guys are going to get a lot of runway. What do you think about that, Scott? I mean, really, did they have any other choice after how quickly Frank Reich was tossed out of here?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, Frank Reich had 4 years and lasted 11 games. So he lasted about roughly 1/6 of his contract. So I think we know by now that Dave Tepper is not adverse to paying off somebody that's not working out to not work. I think Canales and Morgan will get maybe 2 years, and then by year 3, if it's not turned around, then probably be searching again because I don't think they're gonna. I don't think the Rome wasn't built in a day. It might take 5 years, might take 6 years. Some of the things Dave Tepper said about the Matt Rule tenure, I don't think he's going to say those things again. I think no matter what the contract's important because that'll get them paid if they don't make it. But and it's important in the other way too. Let's say Canales is great and they win. I wrote in the column today, if he wins 8 games this coming year, I think he'll be coach of the year. If you go from 2 to 8, you'd get some coach of the year votes at least. Now, I will say this, that line you just said, that concerns me. I didn't like that being in the press release. That feels to me like them saying, yeah, and Dave Tepper's still in charge, and don't forget it. Both Morgan and Canales will be reporting to Dave Tepper. And as I wrote in this column, I think it has a chance to work, this pairing. I think he just hired a couple of smart people, but he's got to get out of the way. He's got to get out of the way.
Yeah, I don't like the idea of him being a tiebreaker. That was something that he kind of mentioned after Frank Reich was fired, that he was kind of, he didn't want to weigh in until it was final and there was a disagreement. I mean, listen, I've said this several times. Personnel people are hired to scout and to find players. Coaches are then hired to coach those players. I understand you want a separation of church and state, so to speak, but let people do their jobs. I really you'll even see it in our writing. You're the columnist. I'm the beat writer, right? We have different styles. We have different approaches. And I think, everybody's hired to do the job that they're doing. And, some would say we're a well-oiled machine. But I would say for the Panthers, this offense is pretty much a clean slate outside of Bryce Young, Adam Thielen, maybe some, Tommy Tremble, Chuba Hubbard, the offensive line. They have to figure out a way to just revitalize this group, which was, I can't even use the words. I can't find the words for this offense. And so I will toss it over to you.
Well,
And
let's just remember that they did not score a point in January. They were shut out their last 2 games in a row, and I think that hadn't happened in 15 NFL seasons. That's how bad they were. That's where he's starting from. And here's one good thing for Dave Canales. He's starting at a place that if you're entering a new job, you think of yourself and your own, whatever jobs you've ever been in, anyone listening. It's nice to follow the guy who messed it up. I mean, because you're going to look good by comparison. So the fact they were 2-15, worst in the NFL, the fact that they had an offense that was just so horrendous that it was really laughable, got shut out in their last 2 games. There's nowhere to go but up here, and especially offensively. Now, of course, the defense was plenty good. That was a defense that kept them in numerous games, and I feel like the defensive staff and players will be much more, there'll be a lot more stability on that side of the ball. As you mentioned, I don't know, there's all kind of things we'll get into in the offseason about all the personnel that needs to change on the front end. But in a way, it's an exciting time. And I'm okay with that. Don't get me wrong. I'm okay with Dave Tepper talking to these guys. Obviously, he's paying them. He wants to talk to them. But I agree. I don't want him deciding if it's 1-1 in the draft room who the number 33 overall pick is. I want those 2 guys to put their heads together and figure it out. And I think it's got a shot. I'm always a little bit optimistic when they hire a new coach, an annual event every January. You and I are both used to this by now. It's third January in a row, I think. Is it? I don't remember. I can't remember all their coaches, but anyway, I'm looking forward to meeting Dave Canales. Have you ever had any, you know, contact with him ever, Mike, or is this going to be new to you as well?
No, he is new to me. I've stood probably 20 feet away when I took a picture of him and Dan Morgan shaking hands in that last game, but that's about it. I did want to bring this up. So Dave Canales had the number 17 passing game in the league last year. The Panthers were 32nd, last place. And that was his first year of play calling. Everybody I've talked to says that he's a very genuine guy, a guy that you want to play for. That's really good for Bryce Young. I think that's really what, a head coaching hire can't just be all about the quarterback for it to be successful. But I think this shows that they are doubling down on Bryce Young. They want to make sure that they have a guy who can bring energy, be accountable, be compassionate, and really reach this quarterback who is very cerebral, who keeps he internalizes a lot, you can see, right? And so
Yeah.
I think that that's important. They're good complementary pieces there at the top. It actually kind of reminds me of when the Eagles hired Nick Sirianni, who was an unheralded coach, didn't get any other interviews, didn't have a lot of experience he was a coordinator in title under Frank Reich, and the Eagles hired him out of nowhere, and he's won over 30 games, went to the Super Bowl last year, or excuse me, in 2022 or 20. Well, technically it was last year, 23. He's had some turmoil this past year, but still won 10 games or over 10 games. And so I think, just as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, just because you haven't heard of this guy or you're not familiar with him doesn't make him a bad hire. And so I think we do need to kind of wait and see on this whole situation, but I'm glad to be documenting it alongside you and Alex Zutlow and on Processing Blue. Where can they find all of our stuff, Scott?
It's going to be a fun year. It always is. And, I will say the Panthers are a very newsy team for not being a good team. So we're always thankful for all of our listeners and readers. You can find all our stuff online on charlotteobserver.com. But, of course, this podcast is on YouTube if you're not watching it there, as well as online. We will be back, Mike, with another extended podcast. This is a short version. This is sort of a podcast light because we had to do this one quickly. We wanted to get it in your hands and your ears quickly. But we'll do a more extensive one after they do their press conference, which we anticipate will be not right away. So there'll be a little bit of a gap. In that press conference, we'll hear probably from Dan Morgan as well as Dave Canales, perhaps Dave Tepper as well, not sure. But in any case, there will be lots to talk about. We always appreciate everyone listening. And please turn into Processing Blue and read us at thecharlotteobserver.com. Thank you again for listening.